So could you please tell us your name?
Robert Kenyon.
And could you tell me how many items approximately do you have in your collection?
I would think at least 5,000.
Are those physical items or are those digitised items?
They are documents, photographs and written archive.
What started your love of transport?
The fact that we did not have a car and therefore we relied on mainly the trains, because mother suffered with travel sickness in vehicles, so I always used buses, I always used trains, and one of the things that we used to do on a Saturday afternoon after morning Odeon was to buy a platform ticket and go on Accrington station, which was then a junction, and we were able to spend 3 or 4 hours behaving ourselves, mind you, just taking train numbers, and it was almost a social event as much as a hobby.
And what sort of year would that be?
Well, I think it started about 1952.
And can I ask what year you were born?
1945.
Just at the end of the war. What month?
February.
February. So you just caught the end of the war.
Well, I think when he heard I'd been born, Hitler committed suicide.
And you've told us a story about sport before now. Can you just allude to some famous people that you were in charge of?
Well, when I went to the school, Jack Simmons was still there. And of course he was known as Flat Jack and bowled for many years for Lancashire. And also, a year below me was David Lloyd. And David was such a good footballer that in actual fact, while the majority of the school team were in the 4th year, David was playing for us in the 3rd year. And also, as captain, I also used to nominate him to take penalties. And when he wasn't there, we missed him.
You've got memories of watching Stanley?
Oh yes, yes indeed. Yeah, fond memories actually. I always remember one game where they had a Scottish forward called Watty Dick. And Watty Dick suffered a terrible head injury. Of course, there were no substitutes in those days. And they carried him off. And about 10 minutes later, he returned, practically, I think, from the dead, with a big bandage round his head and carried on playing. But that was football then. And of course, if a player got injured, they used to run on with a bucket of cold water and a sponge.
Can you tell me how the trams operated in the borough?
Well, originally they operated on tracks owned by the council, but operated by the Accrington Steam Tramway Company, which had a lease for 21 years. And they had cars which were trailer cars pulled by steam engines built by Greens at Leeds. So when the lease ran out in 1907, it was renewed every 7 years, and when it ran out in 1907, the council took back ownership, paid the tramway company up, and then decided that they would electrify it. Not only did they electrify it, but they expanded it, the biggest expansion being beyond Church Commercial up to the Black Dog in Oswald. But they also extended the Clayton section from in front of the Load of Mischief through the crossroads to in front of the Conservative Club before the actual bridge over the canal.
And why do you think they ended it there? Was it too steep over the other side?
Possibly, but I doubt very much whether the incline was the deciding factor. I think it was more or less, there was like a tramway boom, and there was a tramway supposedly going to come through from Padiham to Clayton and connect with one that came through from Blackburn, through Rishton at Clayton. These things did not materialise, as indeed train lines didn't materialise. There was supposed to be a train line connecting Accrington through from Marthorne Viaduct through Sabden and joining onto the line through the Ribble Valley near Whalley. But that did not materialise, even though the government actually passed the plans to do it. But I think it was because investment fell away, you know what I mean? And the Depression came on. And I think that a lot of the grand schemes that were proposed just couldn't gain the finance.
So what was the demise of the trams?
Well, the demise of the trams was basically that they were fixed as they were on the tracks and couldn't get out into the suburbs. In fact, they abandoned an extension from the Hillock Vale to the Griffin. So, but of course the bus service went right down into the village. And of course the other services penetrated where trams had never gone before, although they did connect with trams in certain places.
So can you just tell me a bit about the buses when they were formed and how it came?
Well, it came because a lot of other councils were at that time changing from trams to either trolleybuses or omnibuses, and of course although they had permission to operate trolleybuses, they never took that option up. They decided just to use omnibuses, which at that time was again another trend which was going across the country.
Can you explain what's an omnibus and what's a trolleybus?
Well, a trolleybus is one that has it takes its power from overhead lines, and it does that by means of an insulated arm which runs on a wheel, which picks up the current, takes it down to the motors, and then that provides the traction. So they were in actual fact electric vehicles, and they were silent. And one of the arguments was about trolleybuses. You could hear a bus coming, but a trolleybus was virtually silent in its operation.
So what does the phrase omnibus mean?
Well, in France, a gentleman had a shop, and his shop was called Omnibus, and he put on a free bus service in Paris to take people to his shop, and it became known as the omnibus service. But then it was realised that people would use an omnibus service in other areas. So in actual fact, the word omnibus actually owes its derivation to a shopkeeper in Paris.
So it means taking you to the shops?
Taking you to the shops, yeah.
That's fair enough. And in terms of Accrington Corporation, when was that formed?
Well, Accrington Corporation goes back a long way. It goes back before trams and buses operated. But in actual fact, most corporations took control of their own transport systems. And in actual fact, Accrington didn't fully take control until the lease of the Accrington Steam Tramway Company ran out in 1907. So there had been a corporation long before that, but it only involved itself in laying the tracks and not the operations.
Can you maybe tell us a bit about the Accrington Pals in terms of the colour scheme on the buses?
Yes, well, apparently nobody realised it, but the colours of the Accrington buses, which were dark blue with red and gold lining, was based on the regimental colours of the 11th Battalion, the East Lancashire Regiment. And the window surrounds were painted black. You must remember, of course, that they didn't actually intend to buy buses until 10 years after the Great War. And in actual fact, several options were discussed, one of them being green, but it was decided that dark blue and red would be much easier to keep clean in an industrial environment. So that went by the board. But none of the other alternatives were ever listed. And I learned of this from my next door neighbour, who was Jim Hodson, who was on the Transport Committee, and he related this story to me, that is why the buses were painted in the colours that they were. And in actual fact, an investigator went to the museum in Preston, and it was verified that the colours that the corporation had were the colours of the dress uniform of the regiment.
After the war, we talk about the mills, the charabancs, etc. And you were talking about military vehicles being multitasked, being lorries and then being charabancs. And
yes.
Can you explain a bit more about that?
Well, of course, after the Great War, a lot of the vehicles that the army had used were redundant. So in actual fact, they were sold off reasonably cheaply to people who were coal merchants and people who wanted to convert them into charabanc. And some of the vehicles in actual fact were hybrid. They were coal wagons in the week and charabancs in the weekend. Yeah, so quite a lot of them were ex-military vehicles, yeah.
And can you tell me a bit more about Accrington Corporation up to its demise in 1996? You know, what was the journey from the 30s right the way through?
Well, it performed really quite successfully, but it performed under circumstances where non-profitable routes could be subsidised by profitable routes. And they bought new buses quite readily. Quite a lot of them were bodied at East Lancs, and when East Lancs had a fire, they actually allowed East Lancs to build bus bodies in Ellison Street until they could get going again. So they had a good relationship with East Lancs, and they continued to buy new buses for quite a long period. But eventually, in 1984, the government, the Conservative government then under Nicholas Ridley, decided that you could no longer subsidise non-commercial routes with commercial routes. And of course the main commercial routes in Accrington were the Oswald Twistle Clayton via Accrington and the Uncoat Ferngore via Accrington. And routes like Barnfield, Laneside, Woodnook, Ollins Lane, Churchkirk, many of them were losing money. And when they lost the subsidy, of course, they sort of started to rationalise, and they did amalgamate some routes, but others just went by the board. So when they got to 1986, then of course they deregulated the buses, and that meant that anybody could, providing they met the criteria, could start operating buses. And of course, what did they do? They started operating on the profitable routes rather than the non-profitable routes.
So what's your last memory of 1996 and Accrington Corporation? You know, how did it all end?
Well, it all ended in what you call buzz wars, because other operators, even Greater Manchester, Manchester North, started operating into the town, and there was a buzz war between Imron and had been between Imron and Rosendale, which there again weakened the whole thing. You know what I mean? So after 1996, it just gradually buses were replaced, and the memory of the place, the buses no longer carried the livery or a version of it, and in actual fact it more or less just faded away from memory.
Moving on to trains, you've got a love of trains, and that was from your childhood when you used to buy a ticket and be able to watch the trains and have social there. Can you just tell us a bit more about the history of trains within Accrington and District through to Highland?
Yeah, well, when they came in 1948, and they came from two directions, from the Preston direction through Blackburn and from the Manchester direction from Bury, and they met up and Accrington was quite a busy junction. And in the triangle of lines which came into the station, it only had one platform, and this was a cause of great congestion because trains coming from 3 directions were actually having to wait to access the platform. And the engine shed was actually the first engine shed was in the triangle. As it developed and as more and more trains started to come through, the station was expanded in a series of expansions, and a new engine shed was built at the bottom of Crossland Street near the underpass, and that was the main locomotive depot until it too was replaced in the early 20th century, 1999, by one down at Charter Street. And the one that was at the foot of Crossland Street was then used as a carriage shed. So it developed over a period of time, and of course the steepness of the incline from Accrington to Baxenden was the steepest one on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway system, but originally it had been built by the East Lancashire Railway. The East Lancashire Railway also had interests in Blackburn, it had interests in Bolton, and eventually in 1858 it sold out to the L&Y, who were then a rival company. So the L&Y then expanded it, and lines were joined up all over the place. In fact, it was one of the biggest ones in the 1923 amalgamation into 4 big groups, and then Accrington became not 22A as it was shed 22 in the Lancashire and Yorkshire days. It became 24A in the London and the London, Midland and Scottish days. But it was an A shed, which meant it had facilities there to do medium-sized repairs. It had a wheel drop, it had wells where engineers could go underneath them, so it became a host to locomotives from all the other sheds. And when I say all the other sheds, there were sheds at Combe, there were sheds at Burnley, there were sheds at Lower Darwin, there were sheds at Lostock, there were sheds at Skipton, who all sent their locomotives to Accrington to be repaired. If, however, it was a heavy repair or a full service, they went to the then works at Horwich. There was what we called the Mineral Railway, and what it was a railway which served Huncote Colliery. It also served Accrington Brick and Tile, and it also went round Winnie Hill to the industrial estate there, to the court works, and it also went behind the cricket field and on the side of Winnie Hill to the Norrie Brick Works just behind Whalley Road. So that functioned for quite a while. It had its own steam engine, and there were several steam engines operating from around that area, Huncote, which serviced the power station as well. So in actual fact it was quite a hive of activity as far as industrial railway was concerned.
When did the power station close down, and what happened to the freight that was happening through there?
Well, it closed down in the early 90s, I think. I could be more accurate about that, but at that particular time the sidings were just left to, the lines were lifted and it would just get overgrown. But of course the motorway went through there and took part of the sidings. But the site has been, it has been earmarked for a Freightliner terminal. That's where the containers come up on flat wagons and are offloaded and reloaded onto either wagons or other trains. And that's been mooted. in what's known as intermodal working. So I wanted to link that possibility with the possibility of reopening the line from Colne to Skipton. But I have been told that in actual fact they will not amalgamate them, because apparently they've abandoned the idea of financing the, despite CellRAP's persistence, have decided not to finance any extensions from Colne to Skipton. So in actual fact the container terminal will be as a standalone project.
And in terms of your life, I know you don't drive, so buses and trains have been important to you. You know, in terms of your train memories, can you tell us some of those, your early transport memories?
Oh yeah, I mean we used to bunk the sheds, which meant we sneaked around, and if the foreman saw us he chased us off. But in actual fact you could sit on the wall and see most of what the stuff on Charter Street, you could sit on the wall and see most of what was going on.
But what are your memories in terms of where did you go to?
Oh me? Well, my fondest memory is the Accrington Secondary Technical School had a Whitsuntide holiday at a place called St Mary's Bay in Kent. And a lot of us, of course, were train spotters, went down there on this week's holiday, and we went up to Folkestone. Now Folkestone is where the Golden Arrow came down with Pullman carriages, and it stopped on the platform at the station, and the train loco, which happened to be 7004 William Shakespeare, came off, and 3 tank engines took it down to the harbour, which the train engine couldn't do because it's too heavy. And when they brought it back, it had been the train engine had been turned on the turntable, and then went on the other end and took it back up to Victoria. And as it came into the platform, a cinder came off and stuck in my eye, and my eye started streaming. It was terribly painful. And the driver got down and he saw this and he said to me, "What's the deuce?" And I said, "Got a cinder in my eye." And he took a match out of his pocket and he rolled my eyelid back and he took a tissue and flicked it out. So, cheeky beggar as I was, precautious, said to him, "Well, is there something I can do for you now?" And I said, "Come here." The turntable was the end of the platform. She said, "You come down here with a couple of your mates and you can turn the loco around." And it was one that you... And we actually turned William Shakespeare on the turntable and he's had the Golden Arrow on the cab roof, and you know, so that's my fondest memory. That's my only claim to fame as far as railways go. Yeah.
And if we talk about the Mills and Wakes week, you know, the trains were important going across to Blackpool or wherever.
Oh yeah, my goodness me, yeah. You had to book them in advance. Some of the overnight ones that went down to places like Torquay and Bournemouth and wherever, you had to book them in advance. And when they went on sale, they were snapped up almost within a few days. So if you didn't get in, you didn't get on. Mm-hmm. And in actual fact, excursion trains during the Wakes weeks to places like Blackpool and Southport and Morecambe, which were favourites, and Fleetwood as well, or even Scarborough. When the tickets went on sale, people queued up from 6 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, it was a very, very busy station. In fact, they didn't let them on the platforms because there were so many people. They just let the ones that were catching the train that came on the platform and kept the others outside to avoid any crushing or anything like that.
Can you tell me a bit more about your life's works and which sections they're in?
Well, there are basically 4 sections. There's the tramway section, which obviously finished in 1932 when trams were abandoned, although Blackburn still operated to Church Commercial till 1948. But that's where it stopped, and then turned back to go back towards Intac and Blackburn. So Ironburn did have trams running over Redcap and through West End to Church Commercial for 16 years after it had abandoned its own tramway. Buses came in 1928, although they had talked about them for quite some time before. 1922 they started talking about bringing buses in, but they actually started operating in November 1928, and then of course expanded further and further until they had quite an extensive fleet of well-kept, well-maintained buses at Ellison Street.
Your archives talk about the purchase and disposal, all the details, all the minutes, etc.
Yeah.
So it's very extensive, isn't it, and detailed?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Would you say it's the most detailed collection in the world?
Well, although there are quite extensive photographic archives, I doubt whether there's anything as comprehensive as my written archive. So I can put the two together, whereas other people may be able to provide photographs or maybe snatches of written detail. They would not be able to amalgamate the whole lot.
When did you start to do this project?
When I was a boy.
When you were a boy?
Yes, I made notes when I was a boy. Yeah.
So you've transposed those notes into the extensive archive.
I have this thing that if you're going to report something, you do it within a very short space of time, because if you leave it, inaccuracies start to get in there. So in actual fact, I've recorded quite a lot, and the Accrington Observer was a much better paper then than it is now. They had reporters like Roland Johnson, and you could depend on what he wrote, you know what I mean? And there again, because it published twice weekly, the news was pretty current when you got it. So in actual fact, I've leaned heavily on the council's documents. I've leaned heavily on the Observer's archive, but also my own notes, which were made concurrently with what happens, and I still do that, even today.
I know you've mentioned that you also look at the minutes of the meetings.
Yeah.
And that you pull information from there because that's live on the day, isn't it?
Yes.
So how do you access minutes of meetings? Where
Well, they're on microfiche.
And that's at the library?
And that's at the library. And I've had a great amount of guidance and support from John Simpson, who now appears to be in charge of the local studies, and he's guiding me on a lot of things.
We just spotted your wife outside then walking past, who's been tending to the garden. I believe she does the flowers and you do the rest of it. What does your wife think of the collection?
She thinks it keeps me out of more mischief.
So she knows what you're up to?
Oh yes, indeed. Well, in what used to be my son's room now, there are dozens and dozens of files.
So you've mentioned two parts of the collection there, two parts of the four. What are the remaining two?
Well, one is buses from 1996 to the present day, and the other one is of course railways right from the beginning. So in actual fact there's trams, early buses, late buses and railways. So those are the four parts, but they're so large, especially the railway one, that in actual fact they will not all go. There will be more than one folder. So I'll have to decide, as I've decided with the buses, that 1996, when Ironburn sold, is the cut-off point for the first one, and the second one starts then and moves on.
Can you talk us through your most interesting items? You know, what are you proudest of finding?
Well, I'm proud of discovering the fact that the buses were painted in the colours of the regiment, and that came from two people. One was the next door neighbours in Percy Street, Jim Hodson. Now Jim was an Accrington pal. He was invalided out having been gassed, and he and his wife were like an aunt and uncle, because you had people like that those days. They weren't related, but they were like that. So I went for a shopping on a Saturday morning. They bought me birthday presents and Christmas presents, and he used me as a mascot, because he was welfare officer at Howard and Buller's, and they had such a big apprentice school that they had a gymnastic team, and they were part of a consortium, Platts in Oldham and Dobson and Barlow in Bury, and every year they had a gymnastics competition and took the teams to Bolton, to Dobson and Barlow's factory, to compete. And he used to take me along as sort of a mascot for him, you know. And of course, being on the transport committee, I was sat on the front of his bus that was taking this team, and he saw me looking at this guy Arab, number 100, and he said, "Are you interested in Bobby?" Because he used to call me Bobby. I said, yeah, I'm interested. He said, "Do you know why they're that colour?" I said, "No, I don't, Uncle Jim, why?" And he told me. So I thought this is to be got investigated. Now, I also had a friend who drove for Blackburn. Well, he actually initially drove for Darwin Corporation, but then he moved to Blackburn when they amalgamated. And he was very, very interested in buses. And he was sat outside the town hall on a bench watching them come past one day while he was on his break from running a service from Blackburn, or he'd gone on a driver changeover or something. And he said to me, "I bet you don't know why them buses are dark blue and red, do you?" And I said, "No, I don't, Alan." Well, he said it, and he told me this story. So I didn't let on that I already knew, but he verified what Uncle Jim had told me. So I then decided I've got to get in there, because if they started it in 1928, the minutes of the transport around that period, or the Observer, will certainly highlight it, but it didn't. It didn't specify it. But what was specified was one of the councillors, who was a long-standing member on the council, the Transport Committee, said it was a livery that the people of Hyndburn would appreciate. And the only reason that they would have appreciated that livery, because it was quite a rare livery. Not many corporations had a blue that dark, you know what I mean, and combined it with red. Some had blue and combined it with cream, you know what I mean, but it was in itself almost a unique type of livery. The windows were painted black. Now, I've talked to people, very knowledgeable people who've published works, and I've been to the archive of the Omnibus Society and talked to people and asked them, is there any explanation why the windows were painted black? And of course, black is the colour of mourning. And so I think that in order to acknowledge the fact that so many Accrington lads were lost, they wanted to signify that on the livery. And that livery was maintained until they bought 4 brand new buses in 1967, and that was the last time that new buses were didn't carry the black window surrounds, although they had started painting them out on buses that they bought before that. But all the buses that they bought before that had been delivered with black window surrounds.
What's your 5th collection going to be then? What's the next one?
Oh, no, I have to draw the line off.